Good evening. I'm Gabriel Sanders, Director of Public Programs here at the museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's discussion of the war on women in Israel with Elana Sztokman and Nancy Kaufman. Before I go any further, I'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones. C-SPAN is here to film tonight, and if your phone should ring, your shame would be recorded for all of America to see. It's also my pleasure to say that the museum's public programs are made possible through a generous gift from Mrs. Lily Safra. Programs come about for all sorts of reasons. Some commemorate anniversaries, others mark holidays. The impetus behind tonight's program was something more pedestrian and perhaps more profound: an airplane seat. Elana Sztokman was on a plane from New York to Tel Aviv last fall when an ultra-Orthodox fellow passenger delayed the takeoff because he wouldn't sit next to her. For Sztokman, the experience was especially jarring, as she'd just done a tour discussing the place of women in Israeli society. A tour focused on questions like, who gets to sit where in Israel today, both literally and figuratively speaking, and who has the power to make those sorts of decisions. The story of Sztokman's ordeal, as recorded on her own blog and in the online magazine Tablet, became a sensation. It went viral. It cast a light on the sexism that is in many ways at the heart of Israeli public life. We're delighted to have Ms. Sztokman here with us today. She just flew in from Israel. We hope her trip was without incident. Elana Sztokman is the author of several books on feminism and Jewish life, including Educating in the Divine Image, Gender Issues in Orthodox Jewish Day Schools, which last year won the National Jewish Book Council Award in Education. She'll be joined on stage by Nancy Kaufman, CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women. Prior to joining the NCJW, Kaufman served as the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Boston. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
I want to begin by asking Elana, who has written this wonderful book. If you don't have it, you can get it in the bookstore here tonight after this program. And it's really quite a wonderful coming together of the issues that we at NCJW have worked on for many, many years, since before the founding of the state, and we'll talk more about that, with the sort of overarching theme of an intent, I would say, Elana, and I assume it is your intent, and I'll ask you that helping to ensure that the Israeli nation uphold the progressive moral and social vision for which it was established. You say that in your introduction. That was your motivation. So talk to us a little bit about, why this book, why now? And then I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that the modern Jewish state has, is provided and is performing.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to say that there are a lot of, before I answer your questions, there are a lot of places in Israel where the activism of NCJW has been really crucial, especially on the issues that I talk about in my book. So I just want to acknowledge that and really say thank you for all that NCJW does and continues to do in Israel and in America, of course, also. Why this book and why now? So, I've been living in Israel for over 20 years, and we moved to Israel because we believe in it, because we believe in the importance of the Jewish state, and ultimately, we want to see the Jewish state fulfill its mission for being a state founded on a particular morality. It was founded in order to be a refuge for vulnerable people. And so that should really still be, and that's very much a Jewish mission also. So when you see the state of Israel not living up to that mission, especially when it comes to women, you fit into that category, there's something very painful about that. it comes from a belief that I believe that Israel can do better and should do better. So it's interesting that you started with the Declaration of Independence, which does mention sex as something that we need to aspire to in terms of equality. And actually, in the 50s, Israel was probably ahead of the United States on a lot of issues. Women's employment was higher in the 50s. There was a lot of women were expected to work in Israel, and there were even some laws put into place to protect women at work, to protect pregnant women, to protect mothers. There was something called the mommy hours back then, which said, women have to be allowed to leave by 4 in order to pick up their children and things like that. So women were expected to work, and also, there are a lot of images of women in the kibbutz, and we have, Golda Meir, who was elected in 1969. So in some ways, Israel was ahead on certain parameters, but within all that, there was also what you call, the contradictions. So that, for example, the example.
We'll get to those in a minute. Let's stay on some of the images for a minute. So we all are familiar with the kibbutznik woman and all of those of us who grew up on on the power of that image. We're still waiting to have a woman president of the United States, and you had a woman prime minister.
Even a woman vice president.
Right. You had laws in place before we even had a women's movement in the United States. So you had a well-intentioned democracy at the get-go, perhaps a little flawed. Let me ask you this. What happened along the way? Why is it that the feminist movement of the 1960s in the United States really kind of didn't happen in Israel till much later?
Right.
And talk a little bit about those contradictions, those images. Were they real? Were they not real? What was wrong with that picture?
Right. So it's true what you say that the Israeli feminist movement didn't really take off in the in the 60s and 70s the way it did in America, and for the most part that has to do with the sort of survivalist mentality. That when you're fighting for your very existence, that's the only thing that matters. We can't be bothered dealing with social issues. It wasn't just the gender issue that was put aside, or other social issues were also put aside. Issues of racism, of classism, ethnicity, ethnic strife, all of those social issues were sort of like, oh, we can't be bothered dealing with that. We're dealing with war and terror and things like that. So meanwhile, what you had is a society developing very much around army culture, and the army culture is one of the most chauvinistic institutions in Israel, to this day, even though the army has been doing a lot in the last decade to try to remedy that. But at the end of the day, there were a lot of very chauvinistic attitudes and practices that are taking place. So, that dominated Israeli culture for a long time.
And yet, women served in the military in Israel long before they served in the military in the United States.
Right.
93% of all IDF jobs can technically be held by women or men, although we know that that's not the reality.
Right. It's not the reality.
The IDF is known as the great social equalizer, but it seems more so for men than for women.
Right.
So what's wrong with this picture?
Right. So, do you want to talk about the army for a second?
Yeah, talk about the army for a second.
Okay. So for example, in the army, so yes, women, there's mandatory conscription for women in Israel, which Israel is the only country in the world that has mandatory conscription for women. But women are directed towards different jobs, toward administrative jobs and non-combat jobs. Now, you might say like, oh, so what's the problem with non-combat jobs? There's something to be said for that in theory, except for the fact that the combat jobs are the ones that lead to better jobs and better positions in society. It's no accident that both, that Bibi Netanyahu and Ehud Barak and the head of oh my God, I'm blanking on his name, the head of Jewish Home, Naftali Bennett, that all of them were part of the most elite unit in the army, which is the Sayeret Matkal.
Arik Sharon,
Yitzhak Rabin. So the army is this like preparation ground for society, for political leadership and business leadership, economic leadership. And so when women are diverted away from those jobs, so you're creating the basis for inequality. in the rest of society. So, and also until the early 90s, you know, women really couldn't even be in most jobs. It wasn't until the Alice Miller case, who fought to bring women into the Air Force,
the
and
pilot,
that was in 1996. And so after that, then the Army started bringing women into more positions. And today the Army is very aware that they have a problem. Like during the Operation Protective Edge last year, there was a lot of promotion done to show women, but they never released the actual figures, because the actual figures of women in combat is something like less than 4%. So they didn't release the figures. They just, you know, tried to show women in all kinds of really interesting units because they realized that there's a problem. So the Army actually is starting to work on this. But the sort of the very chauvinistic, the macho, is very pervasive, you know, throughout Israel. You see it everywhere.
Okay, so you know, we know that religion has played a very big role in recent years, particularly more so in recent years, in terms of the role of women. We had an experience at NCJW in 2012, 2011, when we were Freedom Riders. We rode the buses in Jerusalem and experienced firsthand what it was like to get on a bus, be sneered at, have people not being willing to sit next to you. And you know, it was a very emotional experience. So talk a little bit about the Mahadrim buses and the bus segregation, and you know, your own story about the bus trip from Bnei Barak that you talk about in the book.
Right. Okay. So I didn't know that there was a such thing as segregated buses, you know, 20 years ago, mostly because there wasn't really a such thing as segregated buses. So I tell the story in the book about how in 1994, when my daughter, she's now an officer in the Army, right? But when she was a toddler, we accidentally found ourselves on a segregated bus. I didn't know it was segregated until I got onto the bus, and she's sleeping on my shoulder, and you know, the guy in the front seat, this, you know, young guy, 20-something guy with a black hat and a beard and a white shirt. It was Saturday night, you know, right after Shabbat. He gets up for me and he goes, "Oh, sit down," because he saw, you know, there I was, a young mother with a baby on my shoulder. And as soon as he gets up, he gestures to me to sit down. The guy next to him, this older guy, must have been like in his 60s, you know, he had a white beard. He looks at him and he goes, right? Like that, like, no, don't. So this poor kid, you know, he's like 23 years old. He looks at me with a baby on my shoulder, and he looks at the guy next to him, and he looks at me, and he looks at the guy, and he's like in this bind, and finally he looks at me and he goes, you know, like, what am I going to do? And he sits back down. And then I go all the way to the back, you know, and find a seat in the back. But that was like my first experience. Like, I didn't know that existed. And the truth is that it wasn't official. It was an Egged bus, but it wasn't an official segregated bus. So I think back to that story, and I think that it was sort of a moment of cultural transition, meaning that the young man's sort of ambivalence represented a shift within his own culture. He sort of was in this place where he thought that it was okay for a woman, you know, to sit there, but the rules around him were changing.
Well, you know, the experience we had was that the women, some of the women, when we sat in the front, came back down from the back of the bus and sat down and asked us in Hebrew what we were doing and why. They themselves were wondering what's going on. The men, some of them put up their hats or they refused to, they came on the bus and refused to sit down next to us, so they had to go to the back of the bus.
Right. Well, it's not unusual for women to be gatekeepers of, you know, the patriarchy. For, you know, you see it here too, you know, it's the Phyllis Schlafly's of the world. Like, there are a lot of places where women take that role of, you know, we're going to preserve the gender order. For lots of reasons, you know, there are women for whom the gender inequality that we have is sort of comfortable and safe and what's known to them, and undoing all that is you know, scary and threatening for whatever reason. So sometimes the women are even more vehement in, oh no, we can't make change.
So one of the contradictions here, of course, and it's good news, I think, which is the Supreme Court of Israel, which is one of the most liberal in the world, and it has this unusual thing that you can petition directly as a citizen. The Supreme Court actually took this case up, right, and ordered the Egged buses, not only that public buses could not segregate, but that they were supposed to put up signs. So when we came to town, it was right after that there were no signs up.
Right.
There were no signs up saying that you couldn't do this. And the bus drivers were ignoring, and they were still segregated. So,
Right.
What's the
Right.
contradiction there, and what's happened since then? And you know that NCJW played a big role in all that.
NCJW played a huge role. I mean, those freedom rides played a huge role, especially in raising public awareness and really and also in terms of collecting data. Following the NCJW freedom rides, that's when the police started taking everything seriously, and they started collecting data on what was really going on the buses, and they found that on the third of all buses, there was some kind of bullying going on, which was really important because everybody was saying, oh, it's not real, it's not a problem, everybody's fine, everything's fine, and it wasn't fine. And what you're talking about, what you said, the Supreme Court made a ruling that there has to be bus signs that say, you can't force anybody, but in reality, the facts on the ground did not match what the Supreme Court said, which sort of represents the government's own ambivalence about it. The transport ministry was sort of ambivalent about all this. They wanted to, appease the Haredi populations, and so the thing that really made the difference at the end, because it was really the bus drivers weren't doing anything about the bullying. So what really made the difference was when the bus drivers started getting fined.
Right.
And the first time that a bus driver got fined, he got fined about a month's salary for letting bullying happen on his bus.
Mm-hmm.
That's when things started to change.
Yeah, it's so funny because Israeli society, my friends in Tel Aviv, and I have a lot of them, thought I was crazy. They said, what are you talking about, segregated buses in Jerusalem? That's ridiculous. I said, you want to come with me?
Right.
They absolutely didn't believe me. So, but that situation has gotten better, correct?
So at its height, there were over 150 segregated lines running through Israel. And since the freedom rides and since all the Supreme Court action and the fining of the bus drivers, it's now less than 50.
Okay, so there's progress there.
It's definitely progress.
That's
but
good.
it's still there, and there's still some tension around it. And also what I live in Modi'in, and so sometimes when I travel back from Modi'in is right near a Haredi community of Modi'in elite, Kiryat Sefer it's also called, and so the Kiryat Sefer buses are much more frequent from Tel Aviv than the Kavim buses. The Kavim is like Eget. So every once in a while, I find myself taking a bus from Tel Aviv that's a Kiryat Sefer bus, and many of them are segregated. Not all, and I haven't quite figured out how I'm supposed to know before I get on whether or not there's an expectation of segregation. I don't know the
Where do you
cues.
sit when you get on that bus?
I recently sat on the front in a segregated
What?
bus. That was about 2 months ago.
Okay.
And
What happened?
I have to admit that I was a little anxious. It's really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's how we felt.
You feel very stared at and unwanted, and you're breaking all these codes, and you shouldn't have to feel that way. You shouldn't have to feel like, oh, well, I'm a woman, and I'm wearing pants, and I'm sitting here where I'm not supposed to be. It's
Imagine
really,
how Rosa Parks felt.
yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit. Well, it's a little bit
yeah.
that feeling of, by very essence of who you are, you're not wanted in this space. It's very hard. It's very, very hard.
So, we've made some progress, and I don't want to depress the audience. I want to let them know that there's challenges and there's opportunities and there's been some successes. Let's talk a little bit about erasing women's public presence and what's been happening in terms of women speaking at conferences. Again, the buses, we'll talk a little bit about the billboards and, some examples of, you tell an interesting story in the book, and you might want to share with Connie.
Okay, so there's this woman named Professor Chani Mayan, and she's a very impressive woman. She spent 45 years working as a pediatric researcher, lung researcher in Hadassah Hospital, and she opened up this clinic for pediatric lung diseases. Very, very, very impressive woman. And so the health ministry decided to give her a prize for her work. Only when the ceremony happened to give her a prize, she wasn't allowed to go on stage. Somebody else went on stage to get it for her. Why wasn't she allowed to get a prize? Because she's a woman, and they wouldn't allow women on stage. So here's a woman who had 45 years of all of this dedicated work, but at the end of the day, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that she's a woman. And so what's really frightening about this is that it's the health ministry. This is not some private little religious group. This is the government. And so you really have to wonder, what this all means. I mean, you
And
have.
this isn't an isolated example.
It's not an isolated example.
There are examples in the post offices and HMO
Yes.
clinics and banks and
Yes.
libraries.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about.
Cemeteries, perhaps I think the most painful experiences are women's exclusions from funerals. Where women can't go to deliver a eulogy. Now this doesn't happen everywhere, but it happens in a lot of different places where and it's always sort of a surprise where suddenly somebody from the Chevra Kadisha will come and say, women this way, or women can't go up to the front, or women can't be, So let's say a man and woman are mourning together. They're segregated in their mourning. And so Iraq, the Israel Religious Action Center, which has also been active, you partner with them, yes?
Yes.
So they collected stories. They collected a book of stories of women in their experiences of being segregated out of funerals of their loved ones. And there's a lawsuit happening now. There's a lawsuit against the municipality of Netanya from one of these women who had this really devastating experience at the funeral of a loved one. So,
And we had the experience with funding Yerushalayim Shamit. We
the
funded
Yerushalayim, okay.
the Yerushalayim Shamit on the buses. We funded posters that had women's images, and they were immediately vandalized.
So there are a couple of facets to the removal of women. So what I just described was the physical removal of women. Okay, and what you're describing is the removal of women's faces. We all saw that with the Andrea Merkel thing, right? In the France thing, where Andrea Merkel was removed. Everybody saw that. But this has been going on for many years. And of course, there's the iconic picture of Hillary Rodham Clinton at the assassination of Osama bin Laden, where she goes like this, and so that image was removed. She was erased out of that picture. So the erasure of women's pictures has taken place in a lot of has already been taking place around the cities of Jerusalem. Also,
you see it when you go to Jerusalem.
Tzipi Livni's picture has been removed from billboards. Okay, so what happened is that supported by the NCJW, this group called the Yerushalmim started a campaign called Lo Metzunzarot, which means we won't be censored, to try to get women's pictures back onto buses. The bus companies, the Canaan Advertising Company, which is the advertising company that's responsible for all the billboards on the buses, they had an official policy which says, we do not put pictures of women on the buses in Jerusalem, which is, they're not a religious company, it's just a secular company, and then this is their policy, no pictures of women on buses in Jerusalem. And then of course all the billboards and all the different government ministries were capitulating to this policy. You had the education ministry where 75% of all the workers are women, would have posters, advertising posters where outside of Jerusalem the posters had pictures of men, but inside of Jerusalem there were no pictures of men. And the clothing companies also, Honigman had separate ads for inside of Jerusalem and outside of Jerusalem, so that in Jerusalem you didn't have to see a picture of a woman. Sometimes they would cut off the head of a woman and just show a woman from the neck down because that was somehow better, cutting off a woman's head. So the Lo Metzunzarot campaign really worked very hard to try to get women, and they went to the Supreme Court, and they also had this campaign of taking pictures of women and girls and hanging them. Women and girls in Jerusalem were taking pictures of themselves and hanging them from their balconies.
That's right.
So the good news is that this campaign worked. So now, again, this campaign, it was also supported by the removal of women's images was supported by the Jerusalem municipality. So the Jerusalem municipality had a marathon. They have a marathon every year, the Jerusalem Marathon. And if you looked at the Jerusalem Marathon brochures, there were no women, no pictures of women running. On their website, there were no pictures of women, right? And this is the municipality. It says, with Nir Barkat, the mayor of Jerusalem, is not a religious man. He's a secular man who agreed to do this, agreed to promote Jerusalem events, secular Jerusalem events like a marathon, to promote them without pictures of women. So, through these campaigns and the Supreme Court and petitioning Nir Barkat, eventually things were changed. And last year, for the first time, the Jerusalem Marathon had pictures of women again. And now, of course, the the women, Ruchel Azaria, who's a councilwoman in Jerusalem.
She's running for Knesset.
So she's running for Knesset now, but in the municipal elections last year, she had to go to the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to agree to allow her pictures on the buses. And so when they finally won, you saw Ruchel Azaria's pictures on the buses with the whole campaign, we will not be erased.
And of course, this is all illegal because
Yes.
Even though there's no constitution, there is the basic Declaration of Independence that is, stands in place. So
Yeah.
it's illegal, and every time that it's brought to the Supreme Court always rules, in favor of women. So again, thank God that we have the Supreme Court in Israel, and they're willing to balance it out. This modesty really is these people who've been, decided that they make up these modesty squads. You talk about that in the book, and you
Yeah.
talk about your own daughter in that. So,
Yeah.
share
Well-
that example of what happened when she was wearing shorts.
Yeah, she gets called names when she's wearing shorts. It wasn't just one incident, it happens a lot where, if she's on a bus wearing shorts, she'll get all kinds of...
She gets stared at and made fun of. Okay,
Yeah.
so, we discussed a little bit about the IDF. Want to talk a little bit about the power of the rabbinic courts.
Yeah.
Because, I think that it's really been the secular forces in Israel that have allowed this to continue. And it is also, unfortunately, undergirds some of the issues that we have cared a lot about for Israel's whole existence, which have to do with marriage and divorce, and the freedom to marry and the freedom to divorce.
Right.
Agunot, chained women, mamzerim, which are the children of chained women, and the whole experience of what happens to a woman because of the power of the rabbinic courts, really. And the fact there are no women on the rabbinical committee, that's changed a little bit with the councils. But talk to us a little bit, because this is a very big area, and hopefully we'll get into it more in questions at the end. How's this looking? Is there hope for what's going to be? How have lawsuits helped or not helped the situation? And, how do you see this as a women's issue, the whole issue of the rabbinic courts?
Right. So the religious monopoly on marriage, divorce, conversion is really probably one of the greatest threats to women's basic civil rights in Israel. The rabbinic court is the rabbinical court institution is probably perhaps the most sexist institution in Israel. There are no women anywhere. Women can't be judges, and women can't even work in the whole organization. And it's based on very strict, extreme interpretations of Jewish law that really treat women really very unfairly. Actually, if you've seen the movie Get, the movie Get, I think, it has a different name in English. It's called the Trial of Vivian Absalom. I recommend to everybody to see this movie to really understand the dynamics of what goes on in the religious court and how detached the rabbinic courts are from basic human sensibilities, basic respect for women as human beings. Like a woman who walks into the rabbinic court is just a complete lesser being, and there's no problem with, the judges telling her how she should dress and how she should move her hair and how she should talk and when she could talk and when she can't. And the assumptions how they talk to women are completely different. So, but the fact that the rabbinic courts have this monopoly on divorce means that women don't have free exit power in marriage. Marriage is controlled is based on the volition of men, which is enforced by the all-male, ultra-Orthodox, state-backed rabbinic court. So you have all of these different layers of control of women's lives, and you have tens of thousands of women who are stuck. They're sort of stuck in limbo in this system that often can drag out for years. Women are subject to all different kinds of extortion to try to gain their freedom.
And then it affects their children, because their children, I didn't know when my grandmother used the word mamza, that where it came from.
Right.
But it came from mamzerim. And so these children who are totally innocent victims, really, can't marry, and
Right.
can't, because their mums are imps. So,
Right.
but
the
one,
rabbinical court actually keeps a blacklist. I have like this secret blacklist of like 4,000 or 5,000 people who are not allowed to marry. This woman named Rivka Lubitch, who's a rabbinic pleader, she's tracking this issue. She's the person who's leading the fight against the terrible harm that's being done to people on this blacklist. So I would highly recommend to everyone to look her up. Google her and Google the Mamzer issue to learn more.
now, one step in the right direction that
Yeah.
happened, I think fairly recently, was requiring women on committees, putting women on committees for the appointment of the rabbinic
Right.
court judges. So even
Right.
though they're not in the rabbinic court,
Right.
itself, they're now women on the committees that pick the judges for the
Right.
rabbinic court. Is that right?
Right. So that's a really important first step. It's a great first step. Having a woman actually work in a professional capacity within the organization would also be a really important first step. Second step. And so there are a lot of women's groups fighting for that as well. But I think ultimately the most important action to be taken to protect women's basic civil liberties in terms of personal status, marriage and divorce and all that, there has to be a separation of religion and state at this point. There has to be a mechanism for civil marriage and civil divorce so that there isn't this monopoly on women's lives. And that's the issue with the rabbinic courts, is that it doesn't even affect just religious women. It's not a matter of choice. It's all of Israel because it's mandated by the state. So that separation of religion and state, I think, is really the most important step for the future of women's basic civil rights in Israel.
And we all know that it was sort of a blind spot, and the brilliant, wonderful David Ben-Gurion
right.
didn't quite envision that we
Right.
would be where we are today.
A blind spot, I think that's a good way of looking at it.
I can say that in our own country, where we do have separation of religion and state, some people have forgotten that and are deciding that it is somehow the government's role to control women's bodies and
Yeah.
reproductive rights. And so we're concerned about this from both the point of view of what's happening in our own country, even though we have separation supposedly, and we are concerned about it in Israel, and have taken NCJW has taken a very active position in supporting a civil marriage or a freedom to marry. It's not just, by the way, civil marriage. It's not just about having a civil marriage option. It's having the ability to get married by a reformer or a conservative rabbi.
Right.
So if you don't happen to want to be married by an Orthodox rabbi, a lot of people don't understand that.
Right.
And it's something that there's now a broad coalition of the Jewish community worldwide who's concerned about this. So let me ask you this. The question that sort of comes out for me in a lot of this is, to what extent has the secular community been complicit? To what extent have they, by not advocating for changes, have non-ultra-Orthodox people and groups capitulated to ultra-Orthodox? And how is that contributing to it? And what is that all about?
Right. So, for instance, the example of Nir Barkat and the Jerusalem Marathon.
Yeah.
So, that's a perfect example. Nir Barkat is not ultra-Orthodox, but somehow he had this idea that the right thing for him to do was to not allow women's pictures on his website or in the brochures or on the buses, for example. And the Canaan Bus Company is another example of, they're not a religious, not the bus company, the advertising company on buses. They're not a religious company, but they think, oh, this is what our advertisers want. So, or, for example, Ruby Rivlin, who's now the president of Israel, when he was Speaker of the House, he made a decision not to allow women to sing in the Knesset choir. Women were supposed to sing. And so he did it because he said, we don't want to offend the sensibilities of the religious parties. Like, it's okay to offend the sensibilities of 50% of the population because they're just women, but we can't offend the religious parties. So it's that kind of thinking which says, we don't want to offend those religious parties that really is the most damaging to women. And it's really interesting for a few reasons. First of all, because it's not really what all Haredi people want at all. It's really just the extremists who want that. And it was proven with the story of this radio station, and this is a really important story, I think, actually. The Kol Barama radio station, this ultra-Orthodox radio station that's funded by the government, does not allow women on air, not just singing. Okay, it doesn't now allow women DJs. It doesn't allow women newsreaders. It doesn't allow women in advertising. It doesn't even allow women to call up and ask a question to the news presenter or to whoever program. If a woman wants to ask a question, she has to fax it in, and it will be read by a man. So a bunch of women's groups got together and petitioned against this and said, this is illegal. So in this Knesset hearing, the business head of the Kol Barama radio station came and said, and he himself also isn't religious, but he's the business manager. And he said, what can you do? This is what our clients want. So originally the government still said, well, you still can't do it. You got to give women a few hours. At least give women, 4 hours a week or 6 hours a week. And at first they agreed, and they didn't do it. They didn't live up to their agreement. So the women's groups pushed more, and finally they said, you know what, you're claiming that this is what your clients want, but we don't think that's true. Which, by the way, when they say clients, they mean men, right? So even men only count as listeners, So what they did is the women's groups led by Iraq and Kolech is the Orthodox feminist organization in Israel. So they got together and they did a market survey, market research, and they called up people who are regular listeners to the radio station. And they did the work really well. Like, they didn't just say, oh, did you hear of Kol Barama? They would say things like, oh, what program was on Tuesday at 10 o'clock? And like that, to make sure that these were the real listeners. And what they discovered, and they said, do you want to hear women or don't you? And what they found was that 60 to 70% of the people wanted to hear women.
Of course.
So that, I think, is a really, really important point.
Did it change?
Of research. So what happened was that the women's groups brought a lawsuit. They sued for 100 million shekels, which is about $25 million. And about 2 months ago, they won.
Wow.
They won the lawsuit, which is a huge precedent. But it was based on this idea that this isn't what people want. It's not even what the Haredi community wants. So what you have is a situation in which some business leaders and political leaders who are secular politicians and secular business leaders have this perception that in order to appease the Haredi community, they have to exclude women. But it's not really what the Haredi community wants, even,
Well, so that before we open it up, I want to talk about some opportunities. I want to sort of segue into a positive. So talk to me a little bit about what kind of collaborations exist between religious feminists and human rights activists.
Right.
Because not everyone understands that there are people within the religious community who are beginning to speak out, and particularly women, but some men too. Right. And what's the relationship between those worlds?
So, like, for example, I think that the type of work that the NCJW has been doing, like with the freedom rides, it seems to me that that because it was the NCJW in collaboration with groups like the religious feminist group Kolech, that this sends a really very powerful message about what we're talking about here. It's a religious issue, it's a feminist issue, it's a civil rights issue. It's all of it together. The New Israel Fund also has convened several roundtables, which consist of 20 or 30 organizations. Half the groups around the table are sort of feminist and religious organizations, and half the groups around the table are secular civil rights types of organizations. And that collaboration, I think, is really powerful. So, for instance, with the radio station, the radio station, the victory was a collaboration between the Kolech religious feminist group and the Israel Religious Action Center, which is, the reform movement, civil rights. And so those kinds of collaborations, I think, are crucial, because it can't just be coming from the religious feminist groups, even though I think the religious feminist groups also play a key role in leading the change from within, because the religious feminist groups are basically saying this is not religion, this is not the way religion is supposed to be. But it's only with the collaboration with secular civil rights activists that it becomes powerful, that you really get the change happening. And I think that's why we've had a series of these victories, like over the buses and over the radio station.
I mean, it points to the power of advocates and activists to actually create change.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps, that's what we've been doing at NCW for over 120 years, since Hannah G. Solomon founded it in 1893. We've been trying to organize Jewish women to make change in the world. Doing it here, we're doing it in Israel, and through the International Council of Jewish Women, doing it internationally. And I think, as you said, there are examples. There's been the Supreme Court, who more than once have gotten, intervened into these situations. The women on the rabbinic councils. It's a start. We've been very involved in UN Resolution 1325, which is that, certain percentage of women, 50% of women should be on all peacemaking committees, need to be represented. So United Nations resolution, finally we've gotten the Israeli government.
I think there's a connection actually between UN Resolution 1325 and change for women all around. There's been a steady increase of women in the Knesset over the past decade. I mean, it's still only about 26 women and the 27 women in the Knesset, which is out of 120, which is still pretty low. But in the last like 2 Knessets, I would say, it's not just that their number of women have increased, but the number of women with feminist consciousness have increased. And so that has brought a lot of these issues to the Knesset, in much more powerful ways, and that's created a whole slew of real activism coming from. And so you have, activism in the judicial branch, and you have it in the legislative branch. So it comes from, and then of course on the ground and the grassroots. And when it comes from all these different directions, I think that's also really important. But having some really strong feminist legislators has been really invaluable, which is why UN Resolution 1325 is so important, because we know that when there are more women around the table, you have more solutions. And that's where the solutions come
The different
from.
approach to decision making. So before I conclude and open it up for audience questions, talk to us a little about the Neely Phillips story.
Oh, so the Neely Phillips. So this is really the most recent victory, which is really quite important. In Beit Shemesh, it's not just that there are signs on the street that say, women can't walk here. There are signs on the street that say, women aren't here and women have to dress a certain way, and it's backed by, it's enforced by violence. You have these different violent thugs, these groups, these modesty squads throughout Beit Shemesh, and especially Ramat Beit Shemesh, that throw rocks and throw all kinds of other things at women when women are perceived as not being dressed the right way or walking in the wrong place. So Neely Phillips, for example, she's an American woman, she's a patent attorney, and she was riding her bike down the street near her house, and she was hit in the head with a rock. So she got together with a few other women who were also hurt by these modesty squads, and together they brought a lawsuit against the municipality of Beit Shemesh to hold a municipality responsible, to say, if you have signs in your city that say women aren't allowed here, or that women have to be dressed a certain way, if violence comes from that, you are responsible. So this lawsuit's been going on for about 2 years, I think, and there were some really difficult hearings because the mayor was really, said some, really obnoxious things to women, basically saying that the women don't really count as his constituents. I can't, again, just like Ruby Rivlin said, I can't offend Haredi men, so it's okay to offend women because, we're just women. So the mayor of Beit Shemesh pretty much said the same thing. It's like, oh, well, I can't offend my constituents, and it's like, women are constituents too, by the way.
And vote.
And vote. So after this 2-year lawsuit, last week, 2 weeks ago already, the courts came down in favor of the women, and they ruled in favor of the women, and they ruled that the municipality of Beit Shemesh has to pay the women and has to remove the signs. So now we're waiting to see. They have 30 days to remove the signs. So we're in the middle of the 30 days now, and we're waiting to see, are they going to take down these signs? Because if the municipality of Beit Shemesh is forced to take down these signs, then that's a huge precedent. And that's a message to the rest of Israel to say, it's not okay to have a sign anywhere in Israel that says women are not allowed here. Or, women can't walk into this clinic if they're not dressed in a particular way. You can't do that. So that's a really, really important court decision. And that's recent. It's all like brand new. Like this is all happening now. It's all shifting now. So, yeah.
So that's a hopeful note. So before I'm going to open it up, I want to just conclude with Elana's own words. And really the book is well worth you getting and reading completely if you haven't already. But I think this is very important because Elana certainly is not anti-religion. And this isn't about being against, Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. It's being against a women's right to have an equal status in Israel. So at the conclusion of the book, Elana says, I want to be clear. I am not suggesting to anyone who is religious not to be religious. On the contrary, I believe religion can be a beautiful thing. Religious life can provide connection, meaning, purpose, community, structure, tradition, heritage, care, responsibility, and so much more. And she goes on to describe, why she's a believer, and what the essence is of religion, and above all, it should guide us to be better, kinder people, and to deeply care about the state of humanity and work to improve it, because after all, that is what religion's supposed to do. The problem, she says, in conclusion, is that so much as what is given to us under the guise of religiousness is just not actually religious at all. Whether it's a Muslim cleric comparing violence against women to training donkeys, a conservative American political candidate trying to control women's reproductive rights with an anti-abortion platform, or a Haredi man spitting at a young woman on the bus. There are people in the world who claim to represent or do things in the name of religion, but who simply are not. This is fundamentally not what it means to be religious. So thank you,
I can't
Elana.
believe I wrote that. That's so
Yeah,
funny.
it's very beautiful. And I want to thank Elana for coming here from Israel. Thank you so much. And we'd like to open it up and see if you'd like to raise any questions about either anything we've talked about or anything else. Yes, right there in the middle.
Hold on, I just have to give you the microphone.
I have a question about the funeral situation. Is this individual rabbis, or is this all in Jerusalem, or I don't really can't grasp that.
Right. Okay. So in Israel, the funerals are controlled by the Chevra Kadisha, which is the funeral organization, and they're state-backed. It's a state institution. Like all it's within the religious ministry. There's such thing in Israel as a religious ministry, which controls things like the Chevra Kadisha and mikvahs, and we didn't even talk about mikvahs either. But so it's like hard in America to wrap your head around this. That like
you're in the United States. We're not talking much about mikvahs right now. It's a very embarrassing situation.
Oh yeah. Okay, we didn't talk about that either.
Yeah.
Right. So in other words, so these are so the Chevra Kadisha is their state salaried, but in each city, the Chevra Kadisha manages and runs funerals, but they have their own city municipal staffs and practices. But it's not just Jerusalem. It's not just it's different cities. These stories have happened in Sfat and in Tveria and in Netanya. And it's sort of a little bit random. Like you don't really know. It's hard to know exactly which cities this is going to be taking place. And also, the funeral is such a vulnerable situation you're in, and it's not something that you necessarily have planned or researched or investigated the way you do, let's say, for a wedding, right?
But is it actually? I think what she's asking, is it actually the particular rabbi who's doing the funeral, or is it the actual cemetery?
No, it's not the rabbi who does. Rabbis don't do funerals in Israel the way you do. It's not that a rabbi does a funeral. It's that you go to the cemetery and you run your funeral, and the Chevra Kadisha is around.
Oh, so it's the
Chevra
Kadisha
imposing.
Okay.
Imposing.
So it's random. So you don't know where.
Right.
Okay.
Does that answer
Thank
the question?
Yes. Other questions? Yes, right over there. I can't see, the lights are. There was another question. I didn't see. I saw a hand up. Yes, I'm sorry.
I came in late, so you may have answered part of this, but I know not all of it. You discussed the rabbinic courts. Are women allowed to be lawyers before the court?
Yes.
And so the women can go in and represent another woman in that proceeding. And then can you elaborate, to whatever extent you can, without being overly repetitious, the status of women on the Supreme Court?
The secular Supreme Court? So the secular Supreme Court has a pretty good record on women. It's had
A women chief justice?
Yeah, exactly. But that's separate from the rabbinical courts. They're two totally separate tracks. In fact, in Israel, in the divorce system, there's something called a race to the courthouse, because even though you can only finalize your divorce in the rabbinical court system, you can actually do everything else in the family court system and just sort of show up to the rabbinical court. Like you can go to the family court where you negotiate custody and you negotiate all the arrangements of divorce, and then just go to the rabbinical court and say, okay, we're ready for the get process. So a lot of women getting divorced like to do that. Like, they like to go to the secular court system where they know they'll get a fair treatment, because there's a lot of research showing that women will get a much fairer treatment in the secular family courts than they will in the rabbinic courts. But you can only open up your divorce proceedings in one place. Like, you can only file for divorce in one place. So there's a race to the courthouse. The men are running to the rabbinical courts because they know that they'll get a better treatment there, and women are running to the secular courts, the family courts, because they know they'll get a better treatment there. And actually, a lot of the hotlines, like domestic abuse hotlines and all kinds of different hotlines in Israel, or counselors will always say, if you're thinking about getting divorced, keep it secret for a while, because you got to get to the courthouse first, and then tell your husband that you filed for divorce.
But isn't it true that even if they get all the paperwork done through the secular court, they've officially been given all that they have? If they don't get the get
right.
at the rabbinic court, they're not divorced in Israel, in the eyes of Israelis. Whereas here in the United States, whether you get a get or not, you're still divorced.
Exactly. There's no such thing as civil divorce.
And there's no such thing as civil marriage.
There's no such thing as civil marriage, no such thing as civil divorce, and so.
Did the head of the rabbinic court object to a female head of the Supreme Court?
They don't have anything to say about it.
Right.
It really is completely two separate systems.
Yes.
So they have nothing to say about the Supreme Court. They can't, and they don't go to the Supreme Court to resolve their issues, because they go to the rabbinic courts.
They don't answer to anyone. I mean, that's really one of the biggest problems, is that the rabbinical courts don't answer to anyone. They answer to their own rules. There's no real accountability in any form.
And there's nothing the Knesset can do to change it.
Oh, there's plenty the Knesset can do to change it, and there's legislation right now that's been introduced to the Knesset to change it. It hasn't yet gotten there. We hope eventually it will, and there's a lot of advocacy going on. One of the issues we didn't touch on that relates to this is conversion. And I know it's a complex issue, but it also impacts on the issue of conversion, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. Because also with conversion, the rabbinical courts have their say. But also, what I would also like to add about the Knesset is that, this last Knesset session was the first time in 30 years that there was a coalition without any religious parties in it.
That's right.
And that had a lot to do with Yair Lapid and Yesh Atid. And Yair Lapid won 19 mandates in the last election because he ran on this platform of really trying to separate religion and state. And he was really the first one in a very long time in the coalition to really say, we don't want any ultra-Orthodox parties. But, in the end, he had Naftali Bennett's party, so it was a little bit of compromise and tension. That's kind of why the government collapsed, actually. Big piece of it. But in this upcoming election on March 17th, it's going to be really, really interesting to see how much power this sort of anti-religious platform gets. How much power this idea that we need a government without any religious parties, how much power that's going to have, because having a coalition without any religious parties in it, I think, is really, really crucial to being able to pass the legislation to separate religion and state.
And what we have found is that until and unless the Israeli secular society sees this in their self-interest, as an issue that they care about. A lot of people, like to say, well, this is an American issue. This isn't an Israel issue. More and more, it's being seen as an Israel issue. Why? Because we have, so many people who are trying to get married in Israel, who've made Aliyah to Israel. We have all the Russians, who it's questionable whether they're Jewish or they're not Jewish. So I think there's a growing sense of, and the reform and conservative movements now are a presence in Israel that they never were before. So a growing sense of, I think, of within Israeli society that there's too much control, and religion is playing too big a role. And we should remember that the synagogue that the Israelis don't go to is the Orthodox synagogue, so they haven't cared that much, but now they have alternatives. So I think that has changed. Other points, questions? Yes, right here. 1 minute, he's just going to bring you the microphone.
Question, is El Al Airlines subsidized by the state of Israel? Or is it entirely a private company?
It's a government corporation. It's sort of this in-between. It's not what it used to be. In other words, it used to be a government. It used to be like a piece of the government. But Netanyahu spent a lot of time separating out different, sort of selling off pieces of the government. Privatizing. So it's sort of this, half-half.
Quasi.
Yeah. So Elana, I wanted to know, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm planning to read it. What happened with the seat on El Al Airline? And did the airline staff support you? How did they react?
No.
You're shaking.
To answer the last question first, the staff didn't get involved. But in previous times, the staff did get involved. The staff tries to accommodate Haredi men who have trouble sitting next to men. This has happened many times. This happened in September. It wasn't the first time that it happened to me. It was just the first time that I blogged about it. So
it happened to me as well, by the way. And they come over to you and they say, "Oh, would you be willing to move a seat?" I say, "No, let him move a seat unless you want to put me in first class, and then I'd be glad to move my seat."
Right. So the reason why I blogged about it was because what I decided to do then was something that I had never really done before, which was that I decided to speak out. And the reason why I decided to speak out was because I didn't want to be, a hypocrite. Like, I didn't want to say, oh, well, I'm going to come to places like this, and talk about, gender segregation. But when it's happening and there are people doing it to me, making me feel like a lesser person, I'm going to stay quiet. Like, that felt wrong. So, the guy was running up and down the aisle for a good 20 or 30 minutes. And so I was sort of watching this happen, and I was watching, the puttering, and he was talking to his friends. There was like a big clan of about 15 or 20, Haredi men all around me. It was 2 days before Rosh Hashanah, so it was a big, Jewish, I don't know what it was actually, but there were a lot of Haredi men on the plane all around me. And so, I'm watching this happen for all that time, and the whole time, like, I have all of these, these thoughts bubbling up in my head of things that I really would like to say, but I'm, sort of holding my tongue. Until finally, like right before he found somebody else to sit next to me, I said, can I say something? And I decided to speak up, and I had to have this, like, while he was puttering, I was having, an internal dialogue about what I should do about this. And so I decided to say something, and I wanted to frame it in a way that he would be able to understand. So I said, how would you feel if instead of men and women, we were talking about Jews and non-Jews? Like, how would you feel if you're sitting here and you're a Jew sitting here on this plane, and a whole bunch of non-Jews say, can't sit next to you. No offense. No offense. It's just, you're going to cause me to sin, or or you're impure. Right? You're really on a higher level, of course, but I can't be near you because it turns my thoughts all bad or something, or it's against my religion to sit next to you. Like, whatever it is that you're going to try to say, it's not going to work. So I tried to say this. Anyway, as soon as I started talking, all these Haredi men, including him, turned their backs on me. Like, one after another, suddenly I'm seeing this wall of black backs. And that, I have to admit, was the hardest part. Because suddenly you just,
it's dehumanizing. It's dehumanizing.
It's totally dehumanizing. You feel like you're not a person. You just feel like you're not a person. And so, I stopped talking, and I sort of sat back, and and I was looking out the window, and I actually started to cry. I was I don't know why. There was something so, and I had just come back from this, 2.5 week, I had all these different talks, and I was traveling around and talking about all this, and then, you're confronted with this reality, and it was really so difficult. It was just so difficult, and then so I wrote this little blog, and I kept saying that had I known that it was going to go viral, I wouldn't have admitted to crying. But once I did, so it's out there, So that was my reality at the time. But what didn't happen from all of that is I still did not get a call from El Al. I'm waiting for the call from El Al to say oh, would you like a free cup of coffee or something? What can we do? Would you like a free extra, 100 points in your frequent flyer club? Nothing. They didn't care. I was a really good flyer too. I was flying El Al. I was coming to New York, 6 to 7 times a year at least and stuff. And I thought they would notice. Yeah. I thought they would say, oh, here's a really good customer.
Did you write them a letter?
I wrote them so many letters. I wrote to them so many times,
And did you hear back? Nothing. You didn't hear back.
And that's when I realized, you know, the Haredi, the reason why the flight attendants listen to the Haredi men is because the Haredi men act on as a block. You know, if one rabbi gets up and says, you know, oh, well, you can't fly halal anymore, then the entire group does it. But we as women haven't found that power in ourselves yet. We don't act as a block.
Well,
And I
that's
think
what organizing is all about.
exactly.
Other
Anyway, that's the story.
questions or comments from the audience? Up there in the back. This is the last question. Okay. There's one there, so I don't know if we can take them both. Okay.
So, wait.
I can't see, so.
It's hard to see.
There was one right back there, the gentleman in the back.
I just wanted to comment is that the synagogue that I go to in Long Island is currently evaluating whether or not to go, whether they should become egalitarian, because right now they have kind of like a compromise solution where some people want to sit separately and some people want to sit together. But it occurs to me that if I'm really unhappy with whatever decision they reach, I can find myself an egalitarian synagogue and go to it wherever it happens to be. But I can't imagine, I just visited Israel in November, and I guess being a man, I wasn't as aware of some of these things happening around me, but I can't imagine how it must be living in a society where women are still battling for these kind of rights after all these years. It just confounds me that this kind of stuff is still going on.
Well, I just want to comment. We live in a society where, you know, we have our Supreme Court telling women telling corporations that they're individuals and they can deny women's rights to contraceptive access. So it's not just, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, it's just not in Israel. It's also right here in our own country.
Corporations are people.
Corporations are people is what the Hobby Lobby decision was about. And that's a very, very scary thing, and there's going to be several cases coming up. So, you know, and I hesitate. I don't want to conclude without saying that we're concerned. Is this the entire Israeli society? No, of course not. But there's signs of something happening that we didn't see 20, 30, 40 years ago in Israeli society. You know, and part of it is because of the growing influence and numbers. It's a pure demographic issue. The growing numbers, both, by the way, in the ultra-Orthodox, and then we didn't mention in the Muslim community, because it's in both. There's fundamentalist, religious, and don't forget, it's not just Jews who can't marry in a civil ceremony. Christians and Muslims can't marry in a civil ceremony because, again, they have to marry according to their own courts and their own religious courts. So it's a much bigger issue, and it is a flaw. I would suggest it's a flaw. Without a constitution, it has never been fixed, even though the intent was clearly stated in the Declaration of Independence, which is why I began with the Declaration of Independence. It's a flaw in the democracy. And we can be proud of this democracy. It is still the only democracy in the Middle East, let's remember. Remember, it's a whole lot better than it is in other countries that surround Israel, where, you know, women can't drive and women can't walk down the street without being fully covered. So, you know, I want to be careful that we put it in perspective. It's something we care deeply about, and we're going to continue to fight around. But it's not all, you know, negative, and it's not pervasive. You're in Haifa or Tel Aviv, you wouldn't even know that this was an issue. But there are signs that are really very concerning to those of us who celebrate democracy and want to celebrate Israel as a Jewish democratic state. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank Elana. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it, and thank the Museum of Jewish Heritage for having us and for sponsoring this. Thank you.
I didn't use my, sorry.